got a question about tank mixing copper with the biological fungicides with the bacterials.
How does it not kill the bacteria?
It depends on what you're mixing it with. So the primary one we're looking at mixing it with is things like Serenade and Sonata, and with those it's not the living organism so much that's doing the job is what they produced in fermentation. So you need to know what you're mixing it with.
How about with insecticides like Entrance?
You know, whether or not it's okay to be mixing with. That's a good question. I would certainly ask the company or see if there's anything in the
I think it's the same thing.
You need to know how the organisms
No,
work.
I think that it's fine to mix copper with entrust, because it's not the living organism that's doing the job, it's the stuff that it has made. And the same with VT is the same kind of thing.
One thing I wouldn't mix copper with is oxidate, especially at the high rate, because they will react.
Yeah, you definitely don't want to mix oxidate.
What happened?
Turned into this very dark green mass of bubbling, called
What you've ended up doing is you're messing around with pH, is my understanding.
Well, what about copper and oils? I think that's, or sulfur and oils or copper and oils? Is that
Sulfur, there's been some warnings of sulfur and oil, yes. Copper and botanical oils, I haven't seen any problems. I think anytime you want to mix products, I would ask the company whether or not.
And you can do a simple jar test. I mean, do representative amounts in a jar and come back, you know, the next day and see if it turned into cottage cheese or not.
A jar test will certainly tell you if two products are compatible. Whether or not one product has affected the other one's efficacy, you'd never know unless you spray it, obviously. But yeah, jar test is good for basic compatibility.
The research possibility, you could look at control of leaf mold, high tunnel tomatoes. It's a big problem.
So is that
Leaf mold and tomatoes.
What is the name of that? Yeah, fulvia.
Have you done any work on that at all? Or?
I've done very little work with leaf mold. I had 1 year where it came in the field, but I have not done trials in high tunnels.
Is anyone else aware of any research that's happened in other states?
Might check Debbie Inglis, WSU.
Washington State. How about in the back?
Yeah, I was wondering if you looked into nanocopper at all, or some of the products you have used over nanocopper.
Nanocoppers. I have not looked at specifically whether or not they were nanocoppers. There's a number of new coppers that are out. Some of them have smaller particle sizes. What I haven't seen them advertised as being a nano copper. Certainly the smaller the size particle, the more effective potentially they could be. A lot of the new coppers, you're using less metallic copper. I think that's a good thing to look at, is how much metallic copper you're actually putting out with any of these products. We're starting to see mixes, so there's a new product called Badge that's a mixture of copper oxy, and it's a mixture of two coppers. The copper hydroxide we usually work with, which is immediately available, and then another type of copper that's a little slower to become available, thinking that you're going to get a longer period of efficacy. So there's a lot of interesting new coppers out there to look at. Does that answer your question?
How about in the back?
I was wondering, for basil downy mildew, how do you know you're buying disease-free seed?
Basil downy mildew. How do you know if you're buying disease-free seed? You don't. I'm part of a project coming up with a seed testing procedure for it. I think you ask the company. Have they looked into where their seed is being produced and whether or not they're making an effort to produce seed in the disease-free area? Yeah, I think that's a good place to start. That is most likely how we brought it into the United States, is on seed.
Is it on the seed or in the seed?
That's another good question, whether it's on the seed or in the seed. Possibly inside the seed, but that we also have not looked at. That hasn't been determined per se.
Does it survive over winter,
Does basil downy mildew survive over winter? It cannot survive over winter here. It has to have living host tissue to survive. So if it survives over winter in Florida, they don't. Southernmost parts of Florida, they're not getting a cold enough time period to wipe it out every year. If they did, we were going to ice it. If we could send our weather down to Florida for the winter, we could maybe wipe it out.
I was wondering, from Allison, you used a 1 to 60 dilution, but could you just make a 1 to 5 dilution and then dilute it down when you sprayed it, so you didn't have to have such a big tank system?
That's a really good question. So I used a 1 to 5. I used a 1 to 60, but could you use a 1 to 5 and then dilute it afterwards? I guess I looked at phytotoxicity of the concentrated extract. I don't know if there were maybe compounds produced during that fermentation that even if you diluted them out, so I can't say for sure. I can't say if that was just there were high soluble salts and you could dilute it out, or if there was actually something toxic produced by the microbes in that situation. But that's a really good question and a good idea to look at in the future, because yeah, making it in a smaller batch and diluting it would certainly be nicer. Thanks.
Abby?
Allison, do you, given the food safety restrictions, how would you recommend that farmers best use either the vermicompost, or I guess I have two questions. I guess would using the vermicompost for transplant production, for example, carry the effects out to the field? Do you think?
Well, it's funny you asked that. Anu and I did a project on that for my master's. I didn't actually plant that question. So the question was, given some of the food safety regulations that are making it harder and harder to apply these materials during the field season, do you get a benefit if you're adding it to the transplant mix? Do you get a carry-out benefit? And the answer is yes. We did a 2-year trial, and we didn't find significant differences in total yields, and this was in an organic production system for tomato, but we found significant differences in early yield with the vermicompost. And my part of the project, I found significant differences in the rhizosphere microbial communities for like all the way through this field season, all the way to the end of August. And that's just from this much in the starting mix. So you're basically
like
impacting
within a plug.
And then I'm taking the roots months later, 2 feet away from that original plug, and I can tell that the microbial community is different on that than all of the other treatments. So we saw treatment differences all the way, and I wasn't expecting that. We thought, okay, well, of course, the roots will be different in the actual potting mix, but once you get it out into the field, you've got all the soil microbes, you've got everything else going on. But and that's actually one of the reasons that I hopped over to Plant Path for my PhD, because this is fascinating. If you're influencing the rhizosphere microbial community for the life of the crop plant by just what you're using in the transplant mix, is that giving us a benefit? You know, so I really wanted to see, you know, suppressive communities like are not just yield, but can you actually get a suppressive benefit with that?
Do you think adding vermicompost directly to your potting mix would be it, or an extract, watering or drenching with an extract in your potting mix in the greenhouse, would they be equivalent? Would they have equivalent effects, do you think, or would there be a different effect?
We haven't looked into that yet. I know that's one of the reasons why I mentioned Neil Matson's ongoing project. He's looking at those two together and in different combinations, and also with the blood meal and some of the things that Anu's been looking at. But he's only looking at nutrient management. I haven't done anything in the greenhouse or the field. Like it took me 6 years just to find out the seed colonizing community and all of that. So unfortunately, I have very little practical information about how that would work. But certainly for nutrient management, they're effective tools. But I'd really like to do some on-farm trials. No one will let me put Pythium in their greenhouse, and I don't know why. I don't get it.
I was just thinking what a whole systems approach might look like to putting some of these things together. Kind of, you know, thinking of your talk, Brian, about what's going on with tillage and fertility levels and weed management within the cropping system. So how do you design a couple systems, including what's in the transplant mix as far as suppressive compost, what's the crop rotation, what kind of rescue treatments are applied, and just try and pull it all together, because what worries me is the farmer still has to take these components and try and implement them in the system they're managing. And although we, won't be able to unearth all the mechanisms of how it's all interacting, but at least you might start to get some insight into, whoa, when you do this one thing, then the key interventions are now limited to this, or or I just think back, like Paul Harlow gave a great talk at the New England meeting, on 100 acres of veg, something going on where there's very little pest pressure because of the compost, the cover crops, the rotation, so he isn't having to do those interventions. I just worry we don't have these side-by-side systems in place to start to try and better understand how the pieces work. And so are you aware of anything that's funded in these larger organic grants? Is anyone going that way?
The only one I know, there was an organic transitions grant a couple of years ago with Brian McSpadden Gardner, and he was looking at like 3 or 4 different transition treatments, like having it in vegetables the whole time, doing a hay fallow, some different cover crops, and then he was looking at the suppressiveness of the soil after the fact, and that a couple of really great papers came out of that. I didn't follow some of their extension stuff. I don't know if they had an extension component, but they found very clear differences. If you're going to transition from conventional to organic, you're going to want to pick this one in this system, and you'll get, better suppressive soils at the end. But other than that, I don't know anyone.
In Ohio State, but that's agronomic crops in Ohio State.
Oh, okay.
But the similar systems trials at Ohio State, at the Worcester station, where they had different comparisons and looking at suppressiveness.
I guess that's what's in the back of my mind. It'd be good to start thinking about what would 4 systems
So
look like.
last year, we know for sure we have the money, right?
Well, yeah, I'm just struck by the contrast between trials that are based on commercial products and off the shelf versus an approach that's systemic and not really commercially viable. Let's just be blunt about it. Yeah. So how do we bridge those 2 technologies? And the whole question about compost tea and compost extracts being recognized as face it, pesticides, as opposed to all these dodgy ways of trying to get around the system. Is there something in IR4 or some other way, some other kind of program that can?
I called IR4.
Yeah,
yeah.
That's sort of an obvious question. I just was wondering, has anyone done it? You've done it, and I'm curious.
So the question is, here we have field trials of commercially available products, some of which are effective, some of which are not. And then here we have a mechanistic trial of a product that can never be commercially viable for Pythium suppression. What's the middle ground? And my vision really is for a separate, oh, we need more regulations. I can't believe I'm advocating for this, but some sort of regulatory umbrella for these mixed species. When I called the IR4, I talked with some of the people there. They said what you'd have to do to register this, even if you figured out which microbe is doing it, you'd have to test all the 9,999 other microbes for environmental safety. I said, that's kind of interesting because according to the NOP, which have the strictest rules on compost safety, this is OMRI-listed, it's the safest thing ever, and you can use it on crops. And you can put it in the environment. So you have the USDA saying this is the safest stuff ever, you can put it in the environment, it's fine. But in order for me to make biopesticide claims with this material, they're like, oh, well, you'd have to take every microorganism living in that material and go through all, which is impossible. Right. So at some point in my life, I would love to see, there was kind of a similar issue with nutraceuticals. You have the FDA and you have, medicines, and medicines, are kind of more like chemicals and the single agent biopesticides would be, and they were actually able to, through a massive lobbying effort, they wanted to make disease claims like, oh, well, this nutraceutical supplement can help you with X disease. Well, you can't do that because it's not recognized as a medicine because it's just a food. And so they actually, through a massive lobbying effort, got a totally separate system for themselves that says, okay, we're not toxic, we're not a chemical, we are like a food product, but we would still like to be able to do clinical trials. So I would love to see something parallel, because really the reason why nobody is investing in this kind of work with the compost is because why would you?
Well,
you can't sell it as suppressive. Even if you find that yours is suppressive in all situations forever, you can't market it that way, so you can't get the added value.
Yeah.
So let's, other questions from growers or interest or future research directions? Yeah?
Question, some brassicas have compounds that are suppressive of lithium, like glucosinolate. Has anyone made teas to try to extract that and use that as a lithium?
That's a good question. Can you answer that? Because I don't know if anyone has, but the biocyanates, I'm going to say it.
Glucosinolates.
Glucosinolates, right.
There's a company that's making a granular biofence. So it's a mustard meal.
Yeah.
It's supposed to serve as not quite as good as using a biofumigant cover crop, but you know, if you can't grow a mustard, then that would be the next choice. But I haven't heard of anybody doing teas.
And don't the chemicals, aren't they only released as the product breaks down in the soil? So it's not that that chemical compound is in the seed meal, it's that it gets released as they're degraded. But in the right fermentation system, that's a really interesting question, and I will put that on my list. Elizabeth?
My answer to your question about the investments is the reason why we need to have land grants and public research is that there are questions like that that don't need to be commercially viable. We need public seed breeders, we need public researchers, and your research is valuable to us, and we can do it without it being on anybody's list or anybody's product. Because as Penelope Turton used to say, nobody knows what I do on my phone at 5 o'clock in the morning.
Thank you for that, Liz. And the irony about this project is that we did do it. This is an industry-university partnership. We're in partnership with Warm Power, and Tom just wants to know how it works. He's like, I know I can never sell this as Pythium suppressive, but hey, isn't this cool? And I'm really glad, because actually I wasn't able to fund this with the normal funding streams. I did get support from the Organic Farming Research Foundation, but I basically had to pitch it as a product development. So we got most of our funding from the USDA SBIR, which is Small Business and Product Development. So yeah, it's very ironic.
She also said, it is all muck and mystery.
I love the mystery. There's job security, because it's going to be a while until we figure all this out.
Other questions? We have a few more minutes yet. So. Yep.
I don't know, I might have missed the beginning, Meg, but do you have any update on lake blight and what's working or not working, or any work at all on tomatoes?
Update as far as the pathogen or on control?
Control.
It's one that I'm not looking at and wouldn't look at from a control perspective, just because I'm nervous about having a trial on lake blight that could affect growers in my area. I've heard a lot of comments of things not working, of what people have tried. I think that's one where we really need to share what people are trying, aside from copper, of what other things will work. I've heard some comments that regalia might have a place. Comments that serenade isn't really working, but that's one I would love to see us maybe start an online chat
I
to
don't
share.
have another product to suggest, but have you seen Bill Fry's results looking at copper? That it's applied, I think, weekly, starting very, very soon. Like Bill Fry can see the lesions, but I don't know.
You can smell the spores in the air.
He just knows it's there. But it looks as good as conventional fungicides if you start soon enough. So I think that's, copper.
Yeah.
So I think that's the message, is that it's all
It'd be
about-
nice to find something else, or maybe an alternation scheme with some other products.
Yeah, I know.
I like
Everybody
Regalia
likes
because
it.
I like the way it's working. It's one that supposedly is boosting the plant's own immune system. So I like
So
that
that
idea,
might
but
extend
a very
even
different
more.
approach. So copper's going directly after the pathogen. Regalia might be helping the plant.
Other questions? Are we at the end? Oh, one more.
Good.
Could you both recommend any literature or any websites that we could go to read more about? I'm mostly interested in reading more about which products we can mix together and how to implement the permaculture into.
I think for what products you can mix together, sometimes it states on the label, and first step I would take is to contact the company and just say, you know, what do you know, what can be mixed together?
And I guess if I had any other questions about using the product, that would be the place to start, or
I think a good place to start is interacting with the companies. I've kind of had a different feel with the companies that are coming out with these products. A lot of them are very small companies. When I do my trials, I interact with them. What rate do you recommend? How do you suggest I use the product? And I follow their guidelines and what their suggestions are and their thoughts. I think that's a good way to go.
There's also a lot of reps that are in the area that are really good. And I imagine they're in the trade show.
Yeah.
Some of these companies are in the trade show, so just visit and see who is a local rep right now, collect your names and cards.
And for the vermicompost, Anu has a lot of fact sheets on the vegetables at cornell.edu. And then our vermicompost website has the same ones there. So looking at different mixes of vermicompost, is it bone meal or blood meal? Blood meal. It's blood meal. I'm not sure where Neil is going to eventually post his. And actually talking about how easy it is to do that phytotoxicity test, I should put that on my website. Because, hey, it's easy. You can do it on farm. You know, you can develop your own recipe.
I'm
yeah.
really interested in testing some stuff out. You guys are having the gyms.
Hey, Sue?
The year that the late blight on tomatoes was so terrible, we had a small plot on the farm where we, by accident, sort of planted the tomatoes in compost pits. We have always had the feeling that the tomatoes that volunteer on compost piles never get anything. So we had this idea that we would dig tree-sized holes and fill them with compost mixed with mycorrhizae and other things, and plant, 50 tomato plants in them and see what happened. And they did not get late blight. Wouldn't that be an easy, nothing's easy, possible research project in a confined environment so you don't infect all tomatoes in New York, in a closed hoop house or something, to expose plants that are in a phenomenally rich microbial soil and see if there isn't something there.
That certainly could be done. As I said, working with late blight just makes me nervous. I would never, I will work on it if it comes into my field, but I would certainly never inoculate. The big lesson that we learned this summer on Long Island, we had our worst outbreak. It was worse than 2009. We believe it started in one garden. And so to me, to watch a huge epidemic start from a really small spot and consumed all of Long Island and then jump to the Sound, it was amazing. So it's disease I definitely have respect for.
And there are different strains of late blight which are more pathogenic against potatoes versus tomatoes. So if that particular strain is not in your area, then it might not have been one that was extreme. But it was, or everybody got wiped out. Everybody else's tomatoes were gone. Well, in 2009, we had the dubious distinction of being the first farm in Maine to be infected with late blight because the greenhouse where the disease plants were brought up from Alabama was just down the road from the farm. So, but we did save our tomato crop. And it was some careful pruning and application of copper, basically. So we but I had a 60% loss in my potato crop.
Has anybody tried anything other than copper?
We used equisetum this year, this time around, and I think it was quite effective. I think it would have been really effective if we could have done it more. We just didn't get to it enough. And I didn't do any copper, whereas the first time around, I think the strain this year wasn't as strong as it was 2 years ago, at least on our.
Yeah, the one we had, this is the first time we've had that strain on Long Island.
Yeah, and it was easier to deal with. But there's one other aspect that I think growers could work on themselves easily, which is when we were hit by the hardest one, a couple of years ago, we had 4 varieties of tomatoes that survived longer than any others, and I kept wondering why. And and we had 50 varieties of tomatoes, and they were all our own saved seed. So we have a combination in those 50 varieties of lots of different seed, from catalogs, etc. But all the ones that were able to combat that strain were seed that we saved from our own soil.
Scott, how did you use the equisetum?
Mix it up and give it the old beady stir, and no, you have to make the tea. You have to boil it first. Forgot that part. Boil it, then give it the stir. And I can't remember the ratio. We just
You didn't ferment it for any length of time.
No.
You used it fresh.
After we boiled it. I think it's incredibly effective, but you have to really, really keep up with it. We've used it.
How often did you apply the equisetum?
Well, depending on when it was wet, but I think we should have done it more often. So, if it rained or we were expecting rain or something, we'd do it. But I think we should have just done it 3 times a week or something like that. It's a lot of work.
All right, folks, we're at time. It's 5:45. I wanted to remind you all that there is a poster session till 6:45, and then there's dinner. Starting at 6:30 in the main hall. But I'd like to thank both of you.